In this video, we're going to go over a setup of a 1910 cart with an 1890 drill on a 2630 monitor. We're going to go over blockage setup, air cart setup, and then a basic GS3 documentation setup. So first place we're going to start, main menu lower right, and we'll go to our air cart. And on this main run page, depending on the controller and your specific 1910, it'll populate 1, 2, or 3 tanks. Those will all be pre-populated. Things we need to know on this page: if we want to increase our rate, we can hit the plus and minus. The plus and minus, they do not change the bar graph. There's another place that you can do that, but if you wanted to increase a rate for a particular meter, we'd hit those plus or minus buttons. This is our master meter clutch engage button. And if your air cart in this particular example has section command, so it's going to have a section set up for your primaries coming out of the meters. As you go down this page, we can have presets for our different rates. So if we're switching between products or fields where we want to change the rates, we can certainly have presets that we can change here in this box, and we'll go into that here in a little bit. Below that, we have some counters, some common counters that you're going to need. E down there, that's our master clutch engage and disengage. And of course over here we have our fan. So if we push the little fan button, we can set our specific fan speed depending on the crop and what we're putting down. Next, we're going to go into our meter setup, so letter G. In this case, we're going to pretend we're putting down wheat. So for a particular product, we have a black roller. For our variable rate step, depending on what you're putting down. So every time we push that plus or minus button, it's going to increase or decrease the rate by a certain amount, is what that button right there is doing. So we set our rate, we set our product, we set our particular meter. We need to make sure that we set both front and rear. When we hit this button down here, that takes us to our MDV values, which is our meter displacement values. If we are calibrating, we'll use the custom, and that's what that number is there. Standard is just based on a particular product. They have predetermined MDV values, but we highly recommend you go through and calibrate every time you change seed, and it can even change between loads. So that's what that MDV value is, so we always want to use a custom. Calibrate button, this is where we would go and would actually calibrate our meters, and you can see our other videos where we walk through that, but we pick the tank that we want to calibrate. We go through and we need to prime the meter, so it has us put a catch bag, and we turn the meter, make sure there's product in it. And if you have a hydraulic cart, you hold down your button and the meter's turned and it spits out a certain amount. You weigh it, and then you come back in here and you enter in how much was actually caught. It's a pretty straightforward process, but you can see our other videos for that calibration. As we go across the top, this is our presets for our rates. So if we want to make a particular jump in a particular field, we can go and we can set different rates in these boxes. Note you've got to make a check mark here, or put a check in that box. That makes it show up there on your home page. So if you're not seeing the rates you want, chances are it's because we don't have a check mark next to that particular box. So down here, if we are running a prescription, that's the only time we would check that box. Not many guys do, but just know that is an option. You'd have to go in and make a prescription and set your specific rates, and you need to go in there and check that box. Okay, so going down to our cart setup, letter H. This is where we go in, and for this example we have a 270 bushel cart. We're going to have a height sensor. I don't know of too many setups where it would not be a height sensor. So that means it's looking off of the potentiometer switches that are either on front or rear ranks, usually on both. These boxes down here, if you have a hydraulic or even the motor or variable rate motor on your transmission, we would make sure that the variable rate drive is checked. If you have a tow between, is what that TBT means. We need to make sure that box is checked, and for our area, that's the most common, is to have a tow between cart. And this box will only populate if you do have section command on your air cart. So if you do, make sure that box is checked. That allows the functionality to work with your 2630. We go across the top. This is where we set our tool. For this example, it's an 1890. The D stands for dual rank. So if you're using both ranks to put down your wheat, make sure and check select the 1890D. We're going to say it's a 40 foot on a 7.5 inch, which is a fairly common setup. So we check that little next arrow. It just breaks down the number of runs particular towers. Need to make sure that both tanks are checked if we're going to be using both tanks. Sensors. The tire speed sensor. In your book, if you look up your specific tire size, it has a predetermined inches per revolution that tire travels. It can vary depending, if your tire pressure isn't where it should be, it might not correctly read your speed. So there is an option to calibrate, which is what this button to the right is. It's pretty straightforward. You go and you measure out a 400-foot course, you hit this calibrate button, and then you drive that particular 400 feet. And then there's another button there that'll pop up where you finish the calibration. If we click on our sensor button again, we can access our height sensor, which is very important. We're not going to be able to plant or map if our height sensor isn't set up correctly. We'll always have the separate button checked. That means that it's looking for a potentiometer height switch, which means it has that arm that it moves up and down. And it actually reads a percentage of all the way up and all the way down. So if you look down here, if you raise and lower your tool, it's going to change that percentage based on what it sees. So that's a good place to go for some basic diagnostics. You should be able to lower that or raise it very slowly, and we shouldn't see any significant jumps. That's a good indicator that you might be having a problem. But up here, this is where we set our start and our stop height. So we want to start recording. What I usually do is right before the openers touch the ground is when I set the start. So you can physically move your SCV to where you like it, and then hit that button there to the side, and it sets that number to current. There's also the stop height. This number might be, you might need to adjust it. If you have a lot of terraces, you might have to have a higher stop height. If you go over a terrace and your seeder kicks off on you, chances are we just need to go in there to stop height, so that way it doesn't kick things off. If we back up, beginning of every season we recommend you calibrate your height switch. So that's what these buttons here are. If we hit the up button, it's pretty simple. We engage our SCVs and we lift it all the way up, and we hit that arrow button there on the side, and then it calibrates all the way up. Same for down. I recommend putting your SCVs or your openers in the ground and pulling forward, so it's at planting depth, and set that as your all the way down, so it knows that the 0% is when we are completely seeding in the ground. So recommend once a season calibrating that height sensor. If we go down to letter I, which is our totals, often a lot of guys miss this, but totals, there's some counters there along with meters, but what I wanted to touch on was under the calculate tab. If we hit this drop down, we have an area test and we have a meter verification. So what I usually do is calibrate and then go in and do a stationary meter verification. We just want to make sure that that meter is going to put out what we're telling it to. So we can go and we can check this box right here. Prime our meters. We need to check this box right here, which is telling it that we're doing a stationary verification. I usually do a tenth of an acre would give you a tenth of your target population. That's how that works, and that's pretty simple math. But put that particular number in there, and you go down, you hold your calibrate switch, and then it spits out what it thinks is a tenth of an acre, and that way you can verify. I'm telling it to put down X amount of pounds. We just want to make sure that it's doing what we want it to. So make sure you go in and do a meter verification after you do your calibration. There's also that area test, which is good to do if your totals aren't coming out correctly. You need to make sure that what it thinks the area it's going is actually the true distance that you're covering. We'll hit on diagnostics, which is our book and wrench, letter J down there. I'll go ahead and do our systems test. We'll just kind of go through what each of these is. For our lamps, for our fan, we can go and we can tell those to come on, make sure that they're working as they should. Hit forward, we can do these different tests. Our fan speed, we can see what it's actually doing. Go and count how many pulses it's putting out. Make sure our sensor, our RPM sensor is working correctly, that sort of thing. If you're having problems with your hydraulic drives, maybe we're not hitting rate or it seems maybe erratic, good thing to do is come in here and do a motor flush, and that just sends a hydraulic flow through there and flushes out any contaminants, that sort of thing. So it's a good thing to do and know about if you are having some hydraulic problems. Here is specific to section command. So if we want to check and make sure that the actuators are opening and closing as they should, we can have somebody go back there and we can watch those actuators open and close that are operating the gates. We can check, put a mark next to them, and we can send out a signal telling those to open and close. It's pretty easy to see if one of those little solenoids isn't doing what it should. So it's pretty simple. It's a nice way to do it when you're stopped and without having to drive and do diagnostics that way. So in this next page, specific again to section command, there's controllers for each one of those, the actuators that supplies power to it. So this is again more diagnostics for section control. So with all that said, that's an air cart setup. So now let's go to our blockage. So main menu, we'll go to our blockage monitor. This is our main blockage page. It's going to show all of our different sensors. If we have them, if we're not getting signal from one, it's going to show up. If we have a particular sensor turned off because it's the sensor's not working, it's going to show up there with an X here on this page. Just a broad overview of what's going on with your drill. So let's go to our setup, letter G. So if we ever need to change this, we'll hit the wizard hat down there, and that allows us to change our blockage setup. So our real fail rate, the 20 seeds per second is more sensitive, and the 1 seed per every 3 seconds is our least sensitive. So the book doesn't have a setting specific to a crop type. What they recommend is set it as low as possible or as sensitive as possible without getting nuisance warnings. So for wheat, start on 10, which is the more sensitive. And if you're getting a bunch of blockage warnings saying that you're blocked and you're not, bump that number down. So on this page, we need to have this no box checked. We're going to be using our bottom chute in this particular example. And we're going to have 8 towers. And for our setup, we have sensors on all of our runs, which is pretty common for this area. We're going to have an all run blockage type. So hit our arrow forward. This is our member module setup. So each of those member modules back on your drill is going to have a serial number assigned to it. And coming out of the factory, those are sequential. If ever you have to do diagnostics or have one replaced, we've got to come in here and we've got to assign the particular serial numbers to those rows and how many sensors we have for that particular member module. So if you ever have to do diagnostics where you're switching those member modules, which are the small black ones that are one for each tower, if you're doing that, we need to come in here and make sure and switch those serial numbers. If we go to letter J, which is our diagnostics, we've got some things we can see under system readings, the member modules and the master module, mostly for technicians, but we want to make sure that there's power to them. So if you get the warning saying that there's a number 5 member module not communicating, you can come in here and make sure that at least you've got power to it, see if it's communicating on the CAN bus, that sort of thing. If we go to tests, there's a test for all sensors. What this does is it just recognizes that the sensors are communicating on the CAN bus. So it's kind of like going to school. You can physically be there, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're paying attention. Same thing for this test. It'll recognize that it's there, but it could still be having problems. So this is a good preliminary test if you're having sensor issues. So with that, we're going to go to main menu, and we're going to go to GS3. So in order to document correctly, there are 3 buttons that we need to go through, and it doesn't matter if you're seeding, harvesting, spraying, planting. If we go through G, H, and I, we're going to have set up everything we need in order to document. So resources, we need to tell the display what we're doing and where we're at. So we need to make sure and have the client, farm, and field, and our task needs to be seeding. And we need to make sure the correct crop year is there so it documents correctly. There's a lot of other information that you can fill out if you want, but these right here, these 5 are the important ones. Next, we'll go to our equipment. So we need to tell it what we're running. So our machine, we need to fill out our model and our name. We need to make sure our offsets are correct, especially with section control. The display needs to know where the receiver is in relation to the tractor, connection points, all that good stuff. Go to our Implement 1, which is our Eric Bair or 1910. These offsets right here are very important. So get out before season, get your tape measure and make sure you measure to these specific points. If you have problems with that, let us know and we can help you walk through where to measure from and to. But these numbers need to be right and correct. Go to our Implement 2, that's our drill. So we got an 1890. We need to make our width is correct, which it's pulling that from our Eric Bair setup. And again, we need to make sure that these measurements are accurate. So next we'll go down to documentation. So the most common complaint the guys will call and say, I'm not painting behind me or I'm not documenting. Chances are that there's too many tabs up here at the top. So there's going to be a tab that populates for each tank that we have. And the furthest one on the left is always tank number 1. So I recommend going through your air cart setup first, because what you put in your air cart setup is going to populate here on this page. So if you put in fertilizer in your front tank, it's going to have a product application under your first tank, and then your planting and seeding in your second tank, which is the most common setup. The book recommends putting the heaviest product in the rear, the back tank, but we need to make sure that there's no more tabs than what we're using. So we've got our product number 1, planting seeding number 2, and this third one is disabled, so we're only using these front 2. But in order to document, anytime there's an asterisk, we need to make sure that there's something in that box. So hit this drop down, and we'll go down and select our wheat. And the other thing that is really crucial is to add a variety. So we hit an add variety, there we see that little asterisk. So if we don't put a variety in that box, it's not going to paint for us. So it doesn't matter what you put in there, something's got to be in that box. We'll go to our second tank. And again, we need to make sure and assign a variety to that tank. So a good check to do, if you go to the diagnostics, in this drop down box you go down to recording. This tells us everything we need to have in order to paint. So we've got our field property defined, our task defined, and our operations 1 and 2. Our number 3 is disabled. So that's a good way to check and make sure that we are going to paint correctly. With that being said, we've gone through the cart setup, the blockage setup, and a basic GS3 documentation setup. If you have any questions, feel free to get a hold of us.